If you're a small business owner, you'll know just what it's like to be the chief everything officer. HR, payroll, employee benefits. Well, Gusto can do all of that for you. Gusto is online payroll and benefits software built for small businesses. It's all in one, remote friendly, and incredibly easy to use. It's quick and simple to switch to Gusto. Just transfer your existing data to get up and running fast. Try Gusto today at gusto.com/lockedonsoccer and get 3 months free when you run your first payroll. That's gusto.com/lockedonsoccer.
The world's biggest soccer tournament has arrived, and you can trade the entire tournament on Kalshi. On Kalshi, you can trade every match from the opening stage all the way to the final. On Kalshi, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there's no house. And as the probability changes, you can buy in and out of your position. For a limited time, download the Kalshi app and use code CUP26 to get $10 when you trade 10. KALSHI Kalshi. Trade the beautiful game. 18 plus only. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Event contract trading involves risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory.
The new LinkedIn Hiring Pro can't undo your last hire. The lone wolf, who you thought was a good collaborator because you didn't have the right candidate insights. But once you hired them, it was all hoarding info, declining meetings, and howling at the full moon? But LinkedIn Hiring Pro can go deeper than just the resume to find you a perfect fit. By using insights from the LinkedIn network to give you a short list of best fit candidates. Hire right the first time with LinkedIn Hiring Pro. Post a free job today at linkedin.com/quality.
Hello and welcome to How We're the Podcast. It's Martin here, and you're joining us for part 2 of our Bobby Kerr deep dive. I'm sure you've caught up with yesterday's episode where we looked back at Bobby Kerr's early career at Sunderland and some of the bits and pieces that were going on around his appointment as captain, but we're going to delve into that a bit more. And of course, we're going to get to when Bob Stokoe came to Sunderland and all that ensued after that. Today, I have got Andrew and Kelvin with me to go through this part 2. So we'll say good morning to Andrew, first of all. How are you?
Hello, good morning. Yeah, not bad at all. It was a good first episode, and as we said at the top of it, we're just fascinated to learn more about Bobby Kerr, so I'm keen to get stuck back into it.
Excellent. And also good morning to Kelvin. How are you, Kelvin?
Oh, I'm good. I can only echo what Andrew's just said there. Looking forward to this. It's such a privilege to get to talk about the little general.
The little general, indeed. Unfortunately, Chris isn't able to join us today, but I'm sure he will be tuning in to see what he's missed out on in this part 2. Now, one of the things that we very briefly touched upon, Andrew, before in part 1, was the fact that it had been Jim Baxter who had kind of given Bobby Kerr the nod that he's going to make his debut against Manchester City. And we talked in part 1 too about the influence that Alan Brown had on Bobby Kerr and potentially the influence that Brian Clough had on Bobby Kerr. They're two very different characters to Jim Baxter. But Jim Baxter, when you read Bobby Kerr's thoughts on Jim Baxter, this was a player and a person who he loved. He thought the world of him as a person. As a young lad, I think he'd been taken to see Rangers play, and he didn't really know any of the players, but he saw this young midfielder on the ball, getting the ball, stroking the ball about, was a head and shoulders above everybody else in the pitch. And he's like, "Who's that?" It was Jim Baxter. Lo and behold, a couple of years later, he's around Sunderland with him. And it's interesting. I found it quite intriguing that Bobby Kerr held Baxter in such high regard, given that he seems very much an Alan Brown disciple, and Alan Brown and Jim Baxter, you wouldn't have thought those two would necessarily rub along together brilliantly. It's a funny sort of little quirk, isn't it?
Yeah, there is a contrast there. I don't know if the fact that Baxter was just another Scottish accent, somebody from back home. I wonder if Kerr recognised that, particularly if you're a young lad in a new environment. Does having somebody from back home to lean on, does that help? Does having somebody from back home who was regarded as like one of your country's greatest ever footballers, a real genius, does that draw Bobby Kerr into him? But as well, we have found and will continue to find in this pod, I just think Bobby Kerr was just like a good bloke, and he could make friends, and he could respect different types of people, different types of personalities. We spoke about how Rory Gregoire remembered him as being personable and a good, reliable, dependable fella. And I just, I said in the previous pod as well, I think Bobby Kerr was just like a quite positive bloke. Still is a very positive bloke. And I think he is just somebody who is willing to give anybody the time of day, respects other humans, and, you know, not somebody who just surrounds himself with people who are exactly like him. He can build friendships, build relationships with different people. Brown and Baxter might seem like they're at completely opposite ends of the scale. Clough, I don't know where you'd put him on that scale, because he had elements of Baxter, the mercurial talent, and could be a bit wayward, but also strongly believed in Brown's ethics and ways of doing things. And yet Kerr was able to just fit in and grow relationships with them. Footballers, well, also I think the fact that Kerr loved football and just wanted to win, he'd align himself with anybody else who loved the game and wanted to succeed. But I just think as a person and as a human, he was happy to rub along with different types of people, experience different people, and just get the most out of life.
And it's interesting too, Kelvin, when we look back on the injuries that Bobby Kerr had. I think you mentioned before we press record that Baxter was one of the first people to come and see Bobby Kerr after he'd been hospitalised through injury. So there was that side to him, which probably you don't read about that much.
No, he's an intriguing character in his own right, Baxter. I just want to say about him, though, that period between sort of 60, 65, I'm trying to think about the game that Bobby went to see Rangers play. I can't remember exactly when it was, but Jim Baxter, when he went to Rangers, he quickly became one of the world's greatest players. You know, he was strutting his stuff on the European stage. He was strutting his stuff for Scotland against world-class football players and doing more than holding his own. He was a Ronaldo or a Messi, Jim Baxter, of that time. And Bobby Kerr was getting to play with his idol. You know, it was his first. I think he talks about that, doesn't he, in that book about Baxter being his first idol. So he's getting to play with his first idol, and that might have been an element of being in awe of him. But I do think that who's the first person to go and see him after he's broken his leg? And it's not Alan Brown, it's not Charlie Hurley, it's not, it's Jim Baxter who rolls in as the first person there. So you can see the attraction. And he's as well, I think Andrew's right, the Scots, they're not that different to other folk. When you're abroad in a foreign country, you do tend to click with your own, And there was a huge Scottish contingent at Sunderland at that time. Probably, Charlie Ferguson liked to recruit from Scotland, and he liked to recruit from that neck of the woods because that was where he was from as well, So there's all these sort of connections going on there. But intriguing. It is. I've always found that quite you're almost at the opposite ends of the continuum with Alan Brown and Jim Baxter. Alan Brown would never have brought Jim Baxter to the club. Intriguing stuff.
And you get back, we talked about the two leg breaks he had, and there were obviously massive injuries for a young player to deal with. Not just the first one, but obviously in his comeback game in a friendly at Ashington on the terrible pitch that Kelvin definitely did not have anything to do with the preparation of, and he does his leg again. Ian McCall's been manager at this point, obviously brought him into the team. by the time Bobby Kerr gets back to fitness after a second leg break, Alan Brown's come back in. And he's given a game in a friendly away at Middlesbrough in the pre-season. And he finally returns, Andrew, to first-team action in the September of '68. And he plays a few games. He plays up as a number 9 on a few occasions, which, as Kelvin says, 5'4", 8 stone, ringing wet little fella. It's not necessarily a battering ram job, is it? But he gets played there. He scores 4 goals in 16 games. But from there, he really establishes himself, doesn't he, as a first-team player? And again, to do that with those 2 leg breaks at the back of your mind, because once it's gone twice, it's going to surely have a mental factor to consider as well as everything else. So to do that and establish yourself into the team, it takes some doing, doesn't it?
Of course it does. It's a huge achievement. Just talking about him there, maybe playing up front and not being a battering ram. He was tenacious, at least. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, okay, he might have looked at these 6'6" defenders and thought, "Oh, how am I going to get past these today?" But he will have given it a bloody good go. He wouldn't have just shied away from it. He will have. Doesn't matter whether he's 8 stone, ringing wet or not. He will have made their afternoons tough. I'm sure of that, just based on the type of person he was and how he would give his all for the cause. But yeah, to then become one of the first names on the team sheet speaks volumes about him. And as well, Martin, when you look at the club and the era he was at Roker Park as a first team player, there wasn't half some turmoil. We talk about the good moments, and there was a day in 1973 which obviously was the peak. But this was a club kind of not really sure where it was going. Don't want to say it was in the doldrums necessarily, but there was a lot happening behind the scenes. He was one of the few constants. As Kelvin turns up every week, Bobby Kerr was probably one of the few players that Kelvin and his mates could say, "Oh, well, we'll know what we'll get from him," because he was dependable and reliable. This whole era, Sunderland have still got this massive dark cloud over them from the 50s and from when Brown first came in. This was one of the biggest clubs in the land, huge expectations, and then it had like a spectacular fall from grace. Brown, you can see why he was the man brought in to try and turn the club around in that position because of his training abilities and his forward-thinking attitude, which we touched on in the last episode. Brown needed figures like Kerr at the club, and he needed figures like Kerr when he came back, because he's coming over from McCall, and there's all sorts of stories of McCall not really running the club properly. Kerr was probably one of the few lads who, were keeping their nose clean and trying to get through things. And throughout the 60s, throughout the 70s, whatever's happening at Sunderland, throughout the good or bad, who's there? Bobby Kerr.
It's interesting when you talk about Ian McCall, because in Bobby Kerr's book, he says, "I always found McCall to be an absolute gentleman. As a manager, he had very little and seemed to be totally at a loss as to how to reverse the downward trend. So I don't think he was very surprised when he got the boot and Alan Brown eventually came back in." But Kelvin, you said a couple of times in the pod that we did yesterday about the type of player Bobby Kerr was in those early days, where he was a forward, he was a nippy winger. What's he like when he comes back from those 2 broken legs? What sort of footballer are we looking at?
His role starts to change. We sold Neil Martin, and we didn't have a centre forward in that season. Trying to think about 68, 69. We didn't have an outright centre forward, and Brownie was kind of playing around with who he had and what he had. And you'll remember I mentioned young Bobby Park. Bobby Park was starting to hit his straps as a right winger. He used to he actually had I'm sure Bobby Park was left-footed. It's just a little oddity, but he used to play on the right wing when he played up front. He was a fine player, Bobby Park. He was going to be a Scottish international, and so he was playing around with what he had, trying to use what he had, and he did put Bobby. He tried Bobby Kerr at number 9. Not just once that season. He did it a number of times in that 68-69 season. And so his role starts to change. We've got Bobby Park. Brown doesn't necessarily want to move Bobby Park from right wing. He's got Bobby Kerr, who's a fine player. Where can he play him? Where's he going to play him? He plays him up front, and with limited success. I don't think Bobby ever thought it was much of a success. But he plays for his manager where he's put, and then it's the following season you start to see him used in this, if you want, a slightly withdrawn role to what he has been doing, and starting to play in the middle of the pitch. Usually on the right-hand side, but he's popping up all over the place when he plays. And this midfield role, this roving midfield role, is what starts to happen to him. I think the other thing to bear in mind that season, the 69-70 season that followed that, Ian Porterfield, who'd come to the club not long after Kerr had made his debut. I'm trying to think whether that was before or after he made his debut. I think it was about almost a year after he'd made his debut. Him and Kerr and Ian Porterfield were really, really good friends. They became very good friends. And what happened when he starts to play in midfield, you've got Porterfield on the left hand side of the midfield, and you've got Bobby Kerr on the right hand side of midfield. I always find, them two playing together in midfield, two Scots lads playing together in midfield, both of them players who, folk said should have been capped for Scotland, because Bobby Kerr, when he got that, there are a number of commentators would say he was an international class winger, Bobby Kerr. And I'm not going to disagree with that. I think he was. But even when they moved him back, he was a classy midfield player. But him and Porterfield, when you ask him what kind of player he was, I always thought Porterfield was like elegant and graceful, and the ball was always under control, and he always seemed to know what he was doing. He was like a Seb Coe of a footballer, Ian Porterfield. If he was a Seb Coe, you know what I'm going to say here. Bobby Kerr was Steve Ovett. It was all blood, sweat, tears. The arms was going. He was skillful. Don't get us wrong, but it was just, you could see the effort. You could see the grit, the sweat, the toil that was going in. They were an interesting pair to watch in midfield, but he had this roving commission, and he'd be popping up everywhere. It's odd. I've always found this odd when you think about Brown as a manager, because he loved his systems and his shapes, and this is how we'll do this. He famously used to get the team to do shadow play, and he always had players, and if they moved from that position, you would feel the lash of his tongue. But Bobby at this time was popping up all over the park. And this was when, as I remember it, that chant that there used to be about him, he's here, he's there, he's nearly everywhere. That wasn't the real words to that song, by the way. This is when this starts to happen. That chant emerges, because he's popping up all over the place. Defense, attack. He's just, and I think as well, when I think back on it, it's his reading of the game that allows him to do that. He's like such a clever reader of the game. Let me give you one example about that. He played with two fullbacks who he had a great playing relationship with, Cease Irwin and Dick Malone, and both of them were inclined to a gallop forward. Right? Quite often, at his insistence, he'd be waving at them, he'd pass them the ball, he'd put the ball into space and tell them to go. And depending on what the situation was, and he would read this, he'd either slot in and defend that space, or he'd be charging up behind them or alongside them. He's looked at the situation and thought, I can go here with him. He just used to read these situations really, really well. And it was I suppose I'm going to say to you, a not immediately obvious attribute that he had in his game, that he was a great reader of what was happening on the pitch, where the gap needed to be plugged, and when he could go once he started playing in that roving commission within the midfield. I'm not sure he always saw that when he was playing as an out-and-out winger, but bear in mind, his time when he played in the first team as an out-and-out winger was relatively short. He was moved back quite quickly into that midfield role by Brown. What a move for Brown! I mean, Brown, what a tactician! He's obviously, because of his relationship with him, he's looking at him and he's thinking, he can do this. He can. I know who I can play in there. I'll play Bobby Kerr in there. It was, even though it was turbulent times and not particularly success, although, you could argue that 71, 72 season, we were threatening to do something that season. You could see there was a team coming. There was this team was coming to the boil. And I think I said it in the first episode that, when Martin Harvey got injured, we were third in the table and pushing, and you could see that there was a team there. Aye, so that was that was how I saw him as a player. His role changed. Did it change because of the two broken legs? I don't know what the answer to that is, but what I would say to you is one thing I noticed about him before the broken legs. He was absolutely at everything. If he lost the ball, he was possibly going for balls that, this youthful enthusiasm to be at everything. When he came back, I always felt he was a bit more considered about what he would throw his leg into. He was more of he became the kind of player that would hassle and irritate you for the ball. He never took the challenge, but he wasn't like diving into absolutely everything. He would, and if somebody beat him, let's say he goes in for a 50-50 ball and, the player gets away from him. If he's lying on the deck, he's bouncing up and chasing back. That was when the clock stand loved him. That's what he was doing. He'd be up and back at or trying to get back at the player. It was a fine entertainment watching him do that. He always got a massive cheer from a lot of supporters when he managed to jump back up and get back and play a part in winning the ball back. That was what I saw out on the pitch from Kerr at that time. But he had the nous and the ability to change his position. Do you know? Am I making myself? He was able to morph into this midfield player that would rove all over the place. Aye.
That's interesting when you talk about that. I guess that characteristic of jumping back up, bouncing back up to chase lost causes, perhaps, and really put that work rate in, because that sets an example for everybody else in the team, doesn't it? It sets a standard for everybody else to aspire to. And leadership comes in many different forms, doesn't it? And you get some leaders who are very vocal and they'll shout and instruct. Others lead by example. Others lead by those sort of effort. that they're putting on the field, and they set the tone and set the standards for everybody else. And, potentially that's a big part of how Alan Brown saw us in terms of appointing Bobby Kerr after Martin Harvey got injured. Because he wanted that level of commitment and enthusiasm and all that sort of stuff in the team. We're going to take a very short break and we're back after a couple of ads.
The world's biggest soccer tournament has arrived, and you can trade the entire tournament on Kalshi. On Kalshi, you can trade every match from the opening stage all the way to the final. On Kalshi, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there's no house. And as the probability changes, you can buy in and out of your position. For a limited time, download the Kalshi app and use code CUP26 to get $10 when you trade 10. KALSHI Kalshi. Trade the beautiful game. 18 plus only. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Event contract trading involves risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
Welcome back to How We Are, the podcast for the second half of part 2 of our Bobby deep dive. And before the break, Kelvin was describing the sort of player that Bobby Kerr was when he got back into the team in the early 70s, Andrew. And we'll fast forward ever so slightly because, Kelvin mentioned there as well about that season, that last full season that Alan Brown had, where we were looking as if we could do something. Martin Harvey obviously got injured. Bobby Kerr was appointed as captain. Fast forward a couple of months, Alan Brown's out the door. He's making changes. If you look at the context of what's going on, things are happening around the club, aren't there? And things aren't quite going as well as Alan Brown would have wanted them to. He gets sacked, and Bob Stokoe comes in, and Bobby Kerr's only been captain for 6 months, and he must be thinking, well, what the hell is going to happen here? Is Bob Stokoe, is this new manager going to bring his own people in? Is he going to get rid of people like me who've been here for quite a while? And it's kind of interesting how that relationship between Bob Stokoe and Bobby Kerr starts and then develops, isn't it?
It is. From what we are told, Stokoe didn't come in and rip everything up that Alan Brown had done. It was just a case of maybe we always hear the phrase releasing the shackles. It was clear that Brown did have something with that team and had instilled some really good aspects to their play, but that maybe needed a different personality to then take it to the next level. Stokoe, when you're new, you're right, you assume they're going to bring in their own people and want to put their stamp on things. It can be risky, though, to just come in and upset the apple cart. I wonder if he's maybe spoken to one or two people around the club. And if he has, I would imagine everybody would all say the same thing about Bobby Kerr. Oh, he's reliable. He's a hard worker. When Kelvin was talking there about work rate and how if he lost the ball, he'd be straight back up and try and win the ball back. That's a big thing a manager wants to hear. Coaches, other players will have said that type of thing about Kerr. I think as well, it's really interesting how you've both touched upon Kerr's role, almost developed into this roving player who would change position as the game develops. That was quite a big call for Brown to allow that, because as Kelvin says, Brown could be quite rigid. So for him to be happy for Kerr to do that says that he really appreciates Kerr's reading of the game and likes the fact that he's got somebody out on the pitch who understands the instructions but has the sense as well to change it if needs be. Stokoe's obviously caught wind of this and thought, well, why am I going to want to risk this? Risk changing that from the start. Maybe down the line he had visions of changing it, and we'll come to that, I'm sure. But once he's in for a few weeks and got his feet under the table and got settled, he must have surely seen everything that Kelvin's told us about Kerr and thought, yeah, okay, this is a player who is committed to the side. I don't think I ever... We talk a lot about Kerr's respect for Brown. I've never once read, though, that he was unresponsive to a new man coming in.
No.
Do you know, for example, we'll go back to Brian Clough for a bit, how the players at Leeds United, who were all massive disciples of Don Revie, they just weren't having Clough when he turned up. They just did not want to know him. Kerr, very driven person, wants the team to win. He doesn't want to see the team at the bottom of Division 2. So I think when Stokoe came in, he must have also been very open to it and willing to give the new man a try. And between them, they've then very quickly, as everything else around them is suddenly taken pace, they've obviously got a bit of a understanding and it's gone from there.
And Kelvin, as we know, Bobby Kerr offers Bob Stokoe the opportunity to appoint his own captain. He said, I'll step back if you want me to. And Stokoe had said, we'll give it a crack. But there was a flu epidemic as well at that time, wasn't it? Which probably gave a little bit of breathing space, a bit of time to get organised, as we know. And then, obviously, Bobby Kerr and Bob Stokoe seem to go well together, don't they? Once things get up and running and things get motoring, that relationship seems to be spot on.
Well, we're in a relegation fight when Stokoe arrives, and that's the brief that he's given by his board of directors, is to, in the first place, he has to make sure that the club doesn't get relegated. So that's what Stokoe. It's really interesting about 1973. If you start, you think, wow, great season, we won the FA Cup, get in there, Bobby Stokoe. And every bloody round that we played in the FA Cup, Bob Stokoe was talking about, we've got a fight on our hands to stay in this division, we've got a relegation fight where we need to work our way out of this hole that we find ourselves in as a club. I think the flu epidemic was interesting. It just gave Stokoe a little bit of time, as you say, a little bit of time to assess his playing staff, a little bit of time to look at what it was that he thought he needed. One of the things he gets that time, and one of the things he does is he goes with the current captain, with the captain that's been there prior to him coming. I would have thought that he's probably had a word with Billy Elliott, who was the caretaker coach, in between Brown leaving and Stokoe arriving. I would imagine that he'd have consulted with Elliott, but he'll have made his own mind up as well in that time that he's had to take stock. And I always think it's quite a telling moment that he's given that time. He's got an opportunity to change it up, as he would see it, but he doesn't take it. What he does is he sticks with Bobby Kerr. And Kerr, like a lot of the players under when Stokoe comes in, seems to revel in people always talk about the shackles coming off, and that anthem that was getting sung about him loads. He'd pop up all over the place. I can remember some people, like there was a lad I used to go to the game with all the time, and around about this time, and he was always saying about what bloody position is that bloody Bobby Kerr playing this week? He always plays the same position, man. No, he doesn't. He's on the bloody left wing. I'm like, for God's sake, it's just football's evolving. Get into it. Football a la Stokoe. It was. He was a key part to whether Stokoe knew this or not. He made the decision. He made a couple of good decisions at that time, Stokoe. You know, he was a clever manager. He he kept Dave Watson at centre half. That was something that Billy Elliott did, moved him back to centre half. He kept Bobby Kerr as his captain. Now, Sunderland were 19th in the second division, and Gates had fallen dramatically. You know, there was a slight uptick when Stokoe came in, but only by a couple of thousand. So the pressure was on, but he made a couple of very, very good decisions, and keeping Bobby Kerr as captain was one of them. Ranked alongside keeping Davy Watson at centre half. You know, I'd put it up there with that decision that he made. Well done, Bobby. Stokoe.
Kelvin, you said something a couple of minutes ago that made my ears prickle about how when Stokoe came in, his remit originally was make sure the club doesn't get relegated. And then he ends up getting us into Europe. I wonder if there's a head coach who that might remind you of these days, somebody who everybody thought was in a relegation fight and ends up getting the club into Europe. Now, that gives me food for thought, because as we discuss the relationship with manager and captain, Kerr went on to become a legend who we're all talking about 50 years later, and we're all saying, isn't it amazing that, you know, the Bobby Kerr Dementia Centre's there to pay homage to him, and everybody who supports Sunderland loves Bobby Kerr. I just wonder if any other captains are thinking about that at the moment and thinking, I might want to hang around Sunderland and see the job through.
You've gone off on a tangent there, Andrew. I don't know what you're talking about.
That's an unusual thing, isn't it? It's an unusual occurrence.
Should we just leave that there? Should we just leave that there?
Food for thought. You're right.
Yeah.
Food for thought. I hope he's listening.
And of course, you know, we know how that season ultimately pans out. Bobby Kerr lifts the FA Cup at Wembley in May. Bob Stokoe was talking about him as his little general. That's where the name comes from, of course, isn't it? And, you know, Bobby Kerr is quite rightly the legendary Sunderland captain, the last Sunderland captain to lift a major trophy in English football. And it's interesting when you look into it as well, what happens afterwards, because you've got the next season. Obviously, we're playing European football. We miss out on promotion by just 2 points. We have a pretty good season, all things told, I guess. Although I presume aspirations were higher that following season because we'd won the FA Cup. But then,
Definitely.
a year after winning at Wembley and lifting the Cup at Wembley, or just over a year later, Bobby Kerr puts a transfer request in. He's heard rumours of Bob Moncur coming in from Newcastle. Apparently, everyone's stopping him in the street going, what's happening? Is Moncur coming? Are you getting the captaincy took off you? All the press reports were saying that Moncur was coming in as captain. Bobby Kerr apparently goes to Bob Stokoe saying, what's going on? Can you tell us what's happening? And Bob Stokoe just says, you're going to have to wait and see. And Bobby Kerr isn't impressed with that at all, puts a transfer request in. And that, again, strikes me as a really odd shift from, you know, a year before, winning the FA Cup, lifting the trophy. Bob Stokoe was sticking with him as captain, talking about how he's his little general on the field and all that sort of stuff. To go so quickly in 12 months to wanting to bring somebody else in to replace him as captain, not just to bring a player in as a leader in the dressing room, but to replace him as captain, and somebody coming from Newcastle as well, where obviously Bob Moncur had a long history with Newcastle, didn't he? Looking back on it, it seems bizarre, Kelvin, but obviously you were there and seeing it kind of play out in real time.
Yeah.
What was going on?
So I think some things to bear in mind here, and you could see why Bobby would be a bit upset, couldn't you? If this was all going on, and it was kind of being played out in the media. You know, with the World Cup was going on. Bobby Moncur was on panels for some of the games. He was a very, experienced Newcastle captain. I mean, arguably a Newcastle legend.
Yeah.
And captain. He was a very experienced Scotland international and captain. And for me, one of the things that Stokoe would have been teased by, might have wanted, was a captain in the centre of his defence. And we had Richie Pitt injured. He needed to do something about the centre of defence. When you're looking at why does he bring Moncur in, he's got this problem at the centre of his defence with Richie Pitt injured. He's got this there's unrest in the team and a feeling like some of these big stars are going to be leaving. Dennis Stewart was angling for a move. He might have gone by that point, actually. I'm pretty sure he had, but there'd been all this unrest about some of the stars of that 73 team. There was internal unrest within the squad about payments and uplifts and contracts and stuff like that. So there was a lot of things that after the excitement of the FA Cup, you would have anticipated expectations would be high, but actually that season was a difficult season to manage in lots of ways. We had Europe for the first time. We didn't quite get it right off the pitch with that. Stokoe was a little bit kind of caught up in that as well. He had a little pop at the supporters for not turning out for the Vasas game, and stuff like that. But I mean, they doubled the price of the tickets for that game. There was all sorts of things, moving parts, if you want, to that. Bobby captains and skippers all the way through that season, and then coming towards the end of the season, this stuff, into the close season, this stuff about Bob Moncur coming, and Bobby Moncur will be the new skipper, and Bob Stokoe's not telling him. I mean, he goes to him, a season before he's gone to him, and like the bloke that he is, he said, "Look, you're new in the door. If you don't want me as skipper, I'm happy to step down. You'll still get from me what I can give. I'll step down and let you have your own man." Stokoe says, "No, let's continue. Let's see how it goes." It goes really well. You couldn't argue that it didn't. It goes really well, to the point at which Stokoe was calling him his little general. That was as the FA Cup campaign progressed, and as the safety, not just safety. I mean, we finished the season 72-73 in sixth position. If we'd had that form all the season through, would have been promoted. So 73-74, it doesn't pan out the way he wants it to. And he's obviously had a bit more time in the door to work out some of the things that he would like for this team and some of the things that he needs for the team. Bob Moncur is a heavy hitter. He's a major force in terms of experience, in terms of captaincy, and in terms of the character that he is. So you can see why Stokoe might want him as captain. I'm not sure what the issue was. Was it something to do with Moncur being away at the World Cup as to why he couldn't tell Bobby what was happening? I do find that bit a bit irritating in relation to why didn't Stokoe just tell him what he was doing? Because it seemed like the kind of relationship that he had with him, that he could have said to him, "Listen, Bobby, what I want you to do is hold your end up as captain till Bobby Moncur gets here, and then when he gets here, he's going to be the captain, but you're going to be the vice captain." Or so. Why didn't he do something just like that instead of unsettling Bobby? Because he does. You're right. He puts a transfer request in, but all the way through that period, of uncertainty, Bobby Kerr isn't saying, he's not going whinging to the papers or anything like that. You hardly hear much from Kerr. The most that I recall him doing at that time is saying, "I don't know what's happening. If you want to know, go and ask Bob Stokoe." That's basically his attitude. You can really get much fairer than that, I don't think, in that circumstance. But it does seem very odd and unfortunate. Yeah.
Sorry if I may jump in. We don't even know if Stokoe necessarily wanted Moncur to be captain, or it was a case of, I mean, from what I gather, Stokoe and Moncur were golfing buddies. So they will have had conversations off the record and what have you. It might have been a case of he was desperate to get Moncur in, and it was Moncur who said, "I want to be captain." Maybe Stokoe saw Kerr as retaining the armband at one point, and then has got forced into this situation where he needs to use it as a sweetener to get Moncur in, and he's then not known how to handle the situation. There could be something along those lines. I don't know. It does intrigue me, this Stokoe's whole era after winning the cup, and we've touched on this in the past. Footballers, all they ever say is they want honesty. And if they say, listen, if a manager doesn't fancy us but tells me, I can deal with it. I get the impression that, unlike Alan Brown, where everybody knew where they were with him, people say he was a disciplinarian and he was strict, but he was down the line, and I don't think he was a bully as such. I think he told people what he thought. Players could at least understand that and deal with that. And we talk about how all these years later, Kerr respected him to the point where he'll not wear denim because of the discipline Alan Brown instilled in him. But with Stokoe, this wasn't the only story where players were left feeling in limbo and not knowing what the situation was, not knowing what the position was. I mean, Roy Greenwood wasn't allowed in a team photo because he had a beard. Do you know what I mean? There were these bizarre stories.
Andrew, it was a ginger beard. Come on.
Right, well, that's harsh. That is harsh because you are talking to a ginger beard right now.
I know I am.
I know you don't like us. I know you don't like us longbacks. Well,
So the interesting one about Andrew, is that Roy Greenwood had a ginger beard when Bob Stokoe signed him.
Well, yeah, this is a point I'm trying to make. Maybe, although Brown could raise his voice and shout and let you know in no uncertain terms if you weren't doing your job, maybe players actually preferred that long term to this era under Stokoe, where yes, the shackles were off, but then you don't know where your position is. You don't know if somebody's going to come along and take the captaincy off you. I can fully understand why players would feel unsure about themselves in that environment. As you said, though, Kelvin, what's remarkable about Kerr is he asked the questions. He asked to be put on the transfer list at one point, but whenever he was picked, he did a job. The same goes for when he was under Adamson. They didn't see eye to eye. They clashed. They butted heads. But whether he was the captain or not in name, Kerr would always do a job for the team and put those personal differences to one side. And once he was on the pitch, played his heart out for the club. And that is why we're talking about him now as a captain, as a leader. Because whether he had the armband or not, you could rely on him. He wouldn't throw a hissy fit or anything like that. He would do the job as best he could.
No, that's absolutely right. And Bobby Kerr ends up spending 18 years at Sunderland. He outsees Bob Stokoe, say Jimmy Adamson comes in to replace Stokoe, and Bobby Kerr's there when Adamson leaves for Leeds as well, isn't he? He sticks around, ends up playing
I think he's.
400.
I
Sorry,
think
Calvin,
he's.
go on.
I was just going to say, sorry, I dived in there and cut you dead. I think that when Jimmy Adamson left, I think that was one of the times Bobby Kerr's reaction to Adamson. He didn't have a great relationship with Adamson.
No.
And I think he was very pleased that he managed to stay at the club long enough to see him off the premises. You know?
Well, but it's interesting as well, again, when you read his book, because he openly admits that he didn't see eye to eye with Adamson and didn't get along with him. But he said he was one of the best coaches he's worked with. His training sessions were fantastic. Every day was different on the training field. He came up with some really innovative sessions and all that sort of stuff. So, again, it's the mark of the man that you can say, I didn't get on with him, but he was fantastic at this. You can see the good that somebody brings, regardless of whether he personally likes them or gets on with them or not. I think that's the real mark of Bobby Kerr. It kind of speaks to what Andrew was saying, wasn't it? About that's why we're sat here in 2026 talking about this chap who left the club, almost 50 years ago.
I saw a stat, about Bobby, and this is one of his attributes, between 1970 and 1979, I think he only missed 23 games.
Incredible, isn't it?
It's an incredible stat, that. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Fantastic.
Yeah, 433 games, 68 goals. Not a bad ratio from midfield either. And that is Bobby Kerr. And I think we've kind of got to the bottom, I think, of why Bobby Kerr was viewed as a really strong candidate for the captaincy under Alan Brown, and why Bob Stokoe stuck with him. And hopefully we've shared a little bit of life for people who maybe weren't around at the time about what made Bobby Captain. That's a good name for him, isn't it? Bobby Kerr, the captain. He was. And the final thing I was going to ask, Kelvin, I think we've probably touched upon this during the course of these two episodes, but if you were going to liken him in terms of his captaincy style to another Sunderland captain, is there somebody similar, or was he unique in terms of Sunderland captains? Is it how he went about the job?
It's a really, really good question, that. The players I would most liken him to, for players of an older disposition, I always felt you could sit him alongside Billy Bremner and Alan Ball, who obviously weren't Sunderland captains, but were renowned men of little stature but massive, massive hearts. And that's what I think. I think Bobby sits easily alongside them two. As a captain, Sunderland captains that I think of, I would say the effect that he had on the team on the pitch, our current captain would fall into the category, the influence that he had on the pitch. There was a lad came along just after him, Tony Towers, who Bobby Kerr played with, who I always thought was his on pitch performances were similar. When Tony Towers was on his game, he swept the whole team along with him. He had some help because Towers played with Porterfield, Towers played with Kerr. He had these other leaders on the pitch with him. So Tony Towers definitely. In later years, even Sean Elliott, Rob Hindmarsh, these kind of inspirational players, I definitely would say these were lads. But these were lads who more probably followed his example. They probably would look at Bobby Kerr and say, that's the kind of captain I want to be. I think there'll be lots of Sunderland captains that have come along since Bobby Kerr and looked at Bobby Kerr and thought, if I'm going to be captain of this team, I want to be the kind of captain Bobby Kerr was.
And I will just say for everybody listening that when Kelvin says our current captain, we are recording this on Sunday the 28th of June. Who knows what's happened in between now and when this is published. Let's hope Kelvin's comment is still relevant and remains so for the foreseeable future. But on that note, we will wrap things up. And I think that's been I've really enjoyed that conversation anyway. I think it's been a fantastic one. So thank you very much, Kelvin, for sharing all of your memories with us about Bobby Kerr.
Yeah, as I said at the end of the first episode, an absolute privilege. He's here, he's there, he's nearly everywhere. Bobby Kerr, Bobby Kerr.
It's excellent. You saved me from having to put the explicit warning on this podcast. And thank you, Andrew, as always.
Thank you. Don't worry, I'm not going to break into song, but hey, that was brilliant. We say this all the time, and Chris says it. Chris wasn't available for the second ep, but it's brilliant hearing Kelvin's recollections of a real, true club legend. And yeah, there's worse ways to spend a couple of hours than talking about Sunderland greats.
It certainly is. And I think it's only right to say, we mentioned the top of the first episode, but the Fans Museum is hosting the Bobby Kerr Dementia Centre. I think it's open 3 days a week. If you or anybody who you know needs some support and assistance there, please look up and get in touch with those guys there, because they do fantastic work. So I think it's a really important and an excellent thing that's happening there. So please do get in touch with the Fans Museum. We will be back tomorrow on How We're the Podcast, and we've got a Q&A episode lined up for tomorrow. Until then, it is goodbye from us.